Thanks for the download. If you enjoy what we're doing and want to help spread the word, then please take a few minutes to like this episode on Spotify, iTunes or YouTube. It'd also be great if you could subscribe to our YouTube channel or even take a few minutes to write a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or on whatever platform you're listening on, as this is the best way of bringing it to new listeners. If you want to support the pod, the best way to do this is via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes, and I'm grateful for recent contributors helping to keep the production costs to the minimum. My guest today is retired Brigadier Maer, DSO MBE, who served for 27 years in the British Army. He was my guest on Pod 91, where we discussed one PWRR's tour of operations on TELIC 4. If you haven't already, I'd give that one a listen when you have the time. In this episode, we discussed the Battle of Danny Boy in Iraq during May 2004. Matt provides the historical context, explaining the rise of the Mahdi Army and the significance of the Danny Boy road junction, which was near the site of a prior incident when 6 British Royal Military Police soldiers were murdered. The discussion then details the complex, multi-faceted engagement of the battle itself, highlighting the bravery and discipline of the British soldiers in taking prisoners and the unusual order to recover enemy dead for identification. This led to a decade-long legal inquiry. Despite the emotional and financial toll, the inquiry ultimately vindicated the soldiers, affirming their professionalism and concluding that the allegations of misconduct were baseless lies. Let's crack on. Matt, thank you for coming back on the podcast and giving up some more of your time for us.
Thank you. No, well, thank you very much indeed for having me back. Very kind of you.
And we've left this one as a separate podcast because, as I explained in the original episode, this is a very complicated discussion point, and we didn't want to get it mixed up in the discussion about the battle group, the overall picture. But if we didn't have this topic to be put on the table, people would ask us why we missed it out. And it's important to get the facts out there, because people will just be disputing what was done. So with the Battle of Danny Boy then, what were the atmospherics like in the area of operations leading up to that battle?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think I touched on really at the last time we spoke, the situation over the summer of 2004 across southern Iraq was that there was an element of the Shia population who followed an individual called Muqtada al-Sadr, who was an imam, and his family, he came from a line of imams and respected religious people. Now, they were effectively, this group, in open insurgency against the US-led government in Baghdad and, by extension, the coalition forces. And what had sparked this was that about 2 weeks before we arrived, American authorities shut down Sadr's newspaper on charges of inciting violence. And as a result of that, fighting broke out in Najaf, Sadr City, which is up in Baghdad, and Basra. And Sadr's soldiers, who were termed the Mahdi Army, attacked coalition soldiers, killing dozens. So the Mahdi Army was on the march, and we arrived at the start of the tour into that very violent situation.
And the Mahdi Army, Matt, were those disaffected ex-military because they disbanded the military? Were they part of the tribal scene? Who were they made up of?
I think they were made up from. I think their common point of reference was Muqtada al-Sadr and his background as a religious leader and his family's background as religious leaders. Their professions and where they came from geographically was almost secondary to that single level of allegiance to Muqtada al-Sadr and the Sadrist ideology.
And what is Danny Boy exactly? Because people throw that name out there, but what is it exactly, and why was it a significant location?
It's a road junction. It's not very glamorous, but that's exactly what it is.
Many a battle fought over a road junction, Matt.
Poured for effect there. That's all it is. It's just a road junction. But absolutely everything was about the fact it was a road junction. Why? Because its geographical context was absolutely everything. So we were, as a battle group, located, as I said before, in the province of Maysan, area about the size of Northern Ireland. Now, this is north of Basra, and the battle group headquarters, which was in the Maysan provincial capital, Al Amara, it's about a 2.5 hour drive along Route 6 between Basra, where the vast majority of the British forces were, and our brigade headquarters was, and ourselves. Now, Route 6, once you got clear of Basra heading north, mainly dual carriageway, wide road, central reservation. But about 30 kilometres south of where we were as a battle group coalescence and battle group headquarters in Al Amara, 30 kilometres south as you headed towards Basra was a road junction where a side road joined that main Route 6, and it was this junction that was called Danny Boy. It was the location of an old former permanent vehicle checkpoint built in the Saddam regime. Why was it called Danny Boy? Simply because the first troops into the area were the Royal Irish Regiment after the war phase, and hence the name stuck with stunning originality for this road junction. But the key point is the side road, because 5 kilometres down that side road, off Route 6, was a small town or village of a place called Majar al Kabir. And that was significant because it was Majar al Kabir. And that was the location of the brutal murder by a mob of 6 British Royal Military Police soldiers in June 2003. Now, what had happened on that occasion is that they had been at the police station in Majar al Kabir as part of their role to train the local police officers. But on the morning of the 24th of June 2003, so about a year before the events we're just going to describe, soldiers of the 1st Battalion, the Parachute Regiment, had been engaged by a hostile crowd, resulting in an exchange of heavy fire. Now, to give an indication of the situation those Parachute Regiment soldiers faced, one senior NCO was to go on to be awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross for his actions that day. And the Chinook sent down to Majar al Kabir to assist with reinforcements took so many hits with no longer than 6 RPGs fired at it that the damage to the helicopter was so severe and the casualties on board mounting that the pilot decided the safety option was to try and return to base. Now, the Parachute Regiment Sergeant in the charge of the QRF said, well, could we land the helicopter away from the immediate danger, debus those who were not wounded in order that they could get into Majar al Kabir and have an effect. But the pilot said, look, if this Chinook lands, it's not going to get off the ground again. It is that shot up. So it was a formidable engagement in that morning. But as the Parachute Regiment were engaged and they started to do a fighting withdrawal, the crowd advanced on and into the police station, and by midday those 6 red caps were dead, having been shot and beaten inside the police station. Now, 2 points about this which we're going to play out in Danny Boy. But firstly, it just demonstrates the sentiment against coalition forces in Majar al Kabir. Now, for any Northern Ireland veterans listening, I would say think Crossmaglen, but more heavily armed, numerous, and willing and capable of going toe-to-toe with the coalition forces 4 hours with medium weapons. And the second key point of what was to follow down the next 10 years was that the perpetrators of those brutal murders of the RMP had never been brought to justice. Now, their names were thought to be known in a very tight circle within the intelligence community, and the government, including the Defence Secretary, had given assurances to the relatives of the murdered soldiers that they would be brought to justice if possible. And within the detail of this, there was a known member of the local militia who was very strongly suspected of being involved in the killings, and he was known by the code name Bravo 1, if you just remember Bravo 1. Although I didn't know his name at the time, I'm not sure any of my team did, but Bravo 1 was the main suspect. Now, all of that background, Muqtada al-Sadr, the Mahdi Army, Majar al Kabir, the murder of the 6 RMP 11 months beforehand, Bravo 1, all of that was going to come together on the afternoon of the 14th of May 2004, and it was going to echo down for the next 10 years.
Can you set the scene for us then? What was the tactical situation on the ground leading up to the battle in that summer of 2004?
Yeah, certainly. So it was a question of geography, really. As I said, our main base was just south of the town of Al-Amara, which had a population of about 500,000 people. And then within the town itself, we had a company base sitting alongside, which was the town hall, effectively, CIMIC House, and that stood for Civil Military Cooperation. And then not directly part of the battle group, and on a different rotation to us, they were sort of not under my direct command, were a company of the Argyll and Southern Highlanders, and they were at a place called Camp Condor. Now, this was 35 kilometres south of Al-Amara, and most importantly for what's about to happen, south of the Danny Boy turning. And the Danny Boy turning was halfway between our main base, Al-Amara, and Camp Condor. So obviously to get to and from our base and Camp Condor, you had to go through that junction at Danny Boy. Now, fatefully, unknown to us at the time, US forces had been engaged in heavy fighting with the Mahdi Army in Najaf on the night of the 13th of May. Danny Boy was to follow on the 14th of May. Now, that city is home to the Imam Ali Mosque, and within that is the Imam Ali Shrine, and that is considered one of Islam's holiest places. At some time during the night of the 13th, 14th of May, the dome on that mosque was damaged. Now, news of that spread to Majar al Kabir and into Al-Amara, and so by late morning on Friday the 14th of May, the vast majority of the population of Majar al Kabir and Sadrists across southern Iraq had learned that the mosque in Najaf had been damaged, and their belief that this was a result of the mosque having been attacked by the US military. Now, I don't know if that's true. I don't even know to this day if that's true, but it really didn't matter at the time, because that sparked widespread anger, obviously, amongst the Sadrist community. And it's very likely that the incitement to violence against the coalition forces took place on Friday prayers that morning, particularly in the mosque at Majar al Kabir. So by early afternoon on the 14th of May, we had a situation where the Sadrists and therefore the Mahdi Army, believing that that significant site had been hit and damaged by coalition forces, were ready to react in a violent way.
It's interesting because on TELIC 1 I was in the divisional targeting cell, and contrary to what a lot of civilian people might think, you don't just drop ordnance anywhere you like, even on a conventional battle space. Now, the likes
Correct.
of mosques had a certain radius drawn around them, likewise with schools. So you can see the importance of protecting mosques and other institutions like that because of the effect that you've just described.
100%. 100%. There is nothing, that is going to cause more problems. And as I say, and it caused us some problems as a result, if these sensitive targets are hit. But as I say, I genuinely don't know even all these years later, whether or not it was hit, it was a rumour, whether or not it was damaged in some other way. But actually, come the lunchtime of the 14th of May, that was a little bit of a moot point. Yeah.
For listeners who may be unfamiliar with the battle, can you give an overview of the engagement, how your soldiers responded under fire, and what stands out to you about their conduct that day?
Yeah, I mean, the Battle of Danny Boy almost is not true. It didn't exist. Actually, it was a very messy series of engagements, as I'll lay out, involving a different number of elements of the UK forces at different times and over a very wide area. It was a very not a neat battle, and it was extremely confusing for all involved as a result. But as I say, set the scene, 14th of May, the day of the battle. It was a Friday, which, as you know, many of your listeners will know, is akin to sort of a Sunday in the UK. So businesses don't open, the government doesn't do business, and it's the time when most people go to the mosque. So given this, the Argyll and Southern Highlander Company commander, who'd travelled up and down from Route 6 between Abu Naji and Condor multiple times, he set off down Route 6 from Abu Naji to Camp Condor through Danny Boy en route, and he went down there to carry out annual report interviews with his soldiers. You might be on ops, but the bureaucracy continues. And actually, as I say, he'd done the journey umpteen times, and a sort of Sunday, as it were, a good time to get that business done. Anyway, he went down with his what's called a rover group, 2 Land Rovers and 7 soldiers, including his female company clerk. They left Camp Condor, went down to left Abu Naji, went down to Camp Condor, nothing significant. They then left Camp Condor and returned north back along Route 6 to Camp Abu Naji at about 4:15 in the afternoon. But as they made their way northward, they were attacked on 3 separate occasions along Route 6 around the vicinity of that Danny Boy junction. Now, each of these 3 engagements, again, remember they're only 2 Land Rovers, they got significant incoming fire from Iraqi insurgents, and on each occasion they obviously returned fire and broke clear. Now, in the event, they managed to get through each of those contacts and eventually got back to Camp Abu Naji. And while they were going through these contacts and fighting their way through, they were trying to send messages both as to their situation and their progress, and moreover, to prevent others from driving along Route 6, which is a main supply route, and therefore prevent further problems. But as you know, the communications in that area with the kit we had was atrocious. And so the information was distorted, or was incomplete, or it came or it went. But that series of contacts by the Argylls was the first element of Danny Boy. And what it did was it kicked off the second element, which was that the Argylls down south in Camp Condor, getting these intermittent messages and thinking that their boss was in serious trouble, pitched out 2 platoons to move north and assist. And they too were contacted by insurgents, and they debussed and started to fight through the enemy. So having got the first sort of contact out the way, we've now got a second contact, which is developing into quite a substantive battle to the south. Ironically, one of those platoons from the Argylls was actually a PWRR platoon. You could not make this up. The Argylls have been reinforced by a PWRR platoon for their 6-month tour. As I say, they were on a different tasking, on a different rotation. I think they're about halfway through their tour as we arrived. But the PWRR guys who thought they were going to get away from regimental viewing, wrong. They ended up, ironically, in a PWRR battle group A. Hey, can't stand a joke. But anyway, as those 2 platoons, one Argyll, one PWRR, fought up from the south, concurrently, the Household Cavalry turned up Well, of course, the household cavalry, they would. But they had been out on the Iraq-Iran border, which was their role of that sort of reconnaissance. And then they came back onto Route 6, even further south than where I've described at the moment. And they came under small arms fire and RPGs. And so already you're starting to see the mixed units, mixed geography, widespread nature of the afternoon. Now, in reaction to all this, 10 Warriors, armoured fighting vehicles from 1 PWRR, and 2 Challenger main battle tanks from the Queen's Royal Lancers, part of the 1 PWRR battle group, started to track south from Abu Naji to assist. But some of those warriors needed to be extracted, first of all, from fighting up in Al-Amara. 2 of them were on QRF, so they were quick out the gate. But the rest sort of were extracting themselves, breaking contact, and heading south. And so you've now got what is developing, as they run into the fight, a northern battle. But again, they're not all arriving together. They're dribbling in. You know, it ain't the Staff Cottage solution here when they say, don't dribble. Well, we was dribbling because it was just grab what you can and get south and get this sorted out. But as they started to move south, they came under small arms RPG fire. And so the warrior soldiers, the warriors were carrying in the back, debussed and started to assault the enemy positions. And if I just give you a sense of what that dismounted combat was like in the northern battle, the company sergeant major and a junior NCO headed west from Route 6 along a trench and started effectively pairs fire maneuver to clear that trench. They came under fire from 2 gunmen. They put down suppressive fire, won the firefight, the firing ceased. They then moved forward, and entering that position, they found 2 gunmen dead with AK-47s, chest webbing magazines, an RPG-7 launcher, and a grenades. They then moved on the next bound, clearing along the trench, came under a further burst of fire. They returned this, suppressed the enemy position, and on arriving in that second enemy position, 2 further armed gunmen. They then pushed on once more, encountered another enemy position. In this one, the company sergeant major noticed the barrel of an AK pointing through a bush, and obviously he fired into that bush and then suppressed that enemy. That enemy fire ceased, and they again found another pair of insurgents dead. And obviously that insurgent did not know the difference between cover from view and cover from fire. But anyway, that just completed the clearance of one trench. But these sort of actions being repeated across the wider battlefield. In the south, that PWRR platoon sergeant attached to the Argylls, clearing the enemy trench, found himself faced as he came round a corner. 2 armed men standing up. One of them turned towards him with an AK and began to aim in the direction of that sergeant, and he killed them. And then south of, also in the southern battle, a number of grenades thrown by the enemy, one of them landing between a private and lance corporal, injuring them both. So, as I say, Danny Boy, widely dispersed geographically, number of units coming in from a number of directions at different times. And the smaller examples I've just given you there of the nature of the fighting on the ground, I think will be recognised by our predecessors, be they in Italy in 1944, and possibly even the Falkland veterans that you've had on, I'd imagine. But really what was to cause the events of the next 10 years stemmed from an order that was then given to remove the enemy dead from the battlefield. And this was the key point of what was to then occur over the next decade. Because it's not normal practice to remove enemy dead from what I would call a live battlefield. Now, the background to this direction was given by Brigade Headquarters, was the idea that Bravo 1, remember him, chief suspect, murder of the RMP in Mac, the Majar al Kabir, the summer beforehand. The idea was that he was likely to have been involved in the fighting, and if he could be identified among the dead, this would be important for the promises given to the families of the Royal Military Police. And so the bodies were to be removed from the battlefield for confirmed identification. Now, there was, of course, subsequently some debate about the practicalities and sense of that order. Indeed, there was debate at the time. But I want to say that in his evidence given to the Sweady inquiry, the brigade commander took full responsibility for the fact that dead bodies were collected from the battlefield. And he also made a general apology in which he expressed his regret for that fact, that the order to collect the dead had been distressing for everybody involved, which it was. And I just really want to quote here from the inquiry chair's remarks in his final report. Quote, "I am satisfied that the Brigadier made that apology because he honestly and decently recognised that as the brigade commander, he was accountable for the order and for the fact that he had earlier given instructions for the dead to be identified. The Brigadier was both a truthful and impressive witness who fully accepted the responsibilities that went with his rank and position and who sought to give a frank and honest answers." And look, for me, that is a great example of integrity, leadership, taking ownership of the responsibility for the decisions you've made. And frankly, others in public life now might want to take note of it. But anyway, look, regardless of the ins and outs of that decision, as night fell in Camp Ebrinnaji, there were 20 enemy dead and 9 prisoners. And my immediate priority was ensure that once photographed and if possibly identified from their possessions, the dead had to be returned to the local community and their relatives, given the religious necessity that not least of which is they had to be buried by sundown the next day. So I contacted the police commander, who was a great ally. He actually came from Majar al Kabir, who's his hometown. And he arranged that the next morning, the dead would be collected from our medics by medical personnel from the local hospital and as from Camp Ebrinnaji, and that happened. And then the 9 prisoners were to be moved to Basra, to what was the divisional detention facility there. They were held with us overnight, fed and watered, until picked up by helicopter the next morning. And so that was the Battle of Danny Boy, and that was the activities of the night after the Battle of Danny Boy.
There was I might be jumping ahead here, but there was also, I think it was part of the inquiry, there was about the way the prisoners were handled. So take it from what you were saying, when the prisoners were in your custody, there was no tactical questioning or whatever going on.
No, not really. No, because first of all, we knew what had happened. There was no further information that we could necessarily gain from them. And also they were going to go down to the professional tactical questioning down at the divisional detention facility. I think my memory might be wrong on this. I think we didn't even expect to have them overnight, frankly. But helicopters, demands, etc. They stayed overnight unexpectedly. But one of the things I'd done before the tour, and I was so grateful for, was that the prisoner handlers came from the REMI guys and girls in the camp, not from those who deployed out on the ground with their close support to their companies, but the folk who stayed in the camp, who were the sort of armourers and the technicians and that side of it. And I did this because before we deployed, we were told, like any unit, you have to have this many people trained in this many courses, and prisoner handling was one of them. And I thought a number of things. I thought, first of all, you can't get this wrong, and there's an awful lot of paperwork involved in it. So whoever you give it to has got to be pretty switched on and diligent and intelligent in that way. Secondly, they have to be available in camp because you never know when prisoners are coming in. If you designated someone from a deploying element, as it were, of your battle group, they could be out on task and they're the only trained people and they might not be able to get back, in time. But whereas these guys were very much about being in camp. And then the third thing was that, of course, because they were not deploying they weren't deploying into firefights and such like, they would not be personally involved in many, many ways with the sort of emotions directly, viscerally, of anything associated with the contact and prisoners taken, like Danny Boy. And, I made that decision because it was, I thought, a sensible decision to make, but actually it paid dividends in the end because I remember going to one of the inquiries that we'll come on to, and there was a REME staff sergeant, and they had found the log of what had happened with the prisoners. And this staff sergeant was reading out in the High Court, with the best will in the world, monotonously, because he was being asked to by the defence barrister, 0200 prisoners given, 1 litre of water, 3 bourbon biscuits, 0400 prisoners given, 1 litre of water, XYZ food at 0600, da da da. And so that really paid off in the end, that the record keeping was excellent. It was done very well. It was done very intelligently, and it was done very coolly and detachedly by those soldiers from the REME.
I also think the fact that your soldiers took 9 prisoners shows the discipline that they had on the battle space as well, because you're often told that an enemy at the point of surrender, whether you're surrendering or your enemy's surrendering, that is a moment where it's a judgment call whether you're going to make it to to a prisoner handling or collection point. So I think the fact again that your guys took 9 prisoners shows the discipline they displayed that day.
100%, and because the inquiries went on for over 10 years, then as you can imagine, every single point of contact was examined, and the reason was because they had to find out. One of the allegations was that we took in pick a number, 15 prisoners, and then we killed X number and only handed back 9, killed 6. So part of the inquiry's necessity was to ascertain exactly the circumstances where the enemy had been killed, and exactly the circumstances where they had been taken prisoners. And so I ran through that advance up that trench through 3 enemy positions. But that was absolutely crawled over the next 10 years, almost like a separate shooting inquiry, as it were, at each point. So, yes, they were extremely disciplined, extremely acting within any rules of engagement, and behaved with extreme professionalism. And as I say, and perhaps later on I'll come on to what the chair of the inquiry said on that very subject.
So once the call signs had returned to camp, and you'd already pointed out the unusual request that they bring back the bodies, were there any other indicators to mark this fight as being out of the ordinary, bearing in mind the numerous contacts the battle group was involved in?
Interestingly, no, really, the scale of it was a standout point for us. The numbers involved, the geographical spread, the intensity of the fighting. But we've been in other situations, and we were going to be in further situations, although we didn't know at the time, of intense fighting. So actually, the only outstanding point at the time was that removal of the enemy dead from the battlefield. And not just because that was an unusual order, but due to the human effect that I've already alluded to, that had on those who were required to do so, as well as the subsequent legal actions arising.
So at what point did you become aware that allegations were being made against your soldiers, and how did you initially respond as their commanding officer?
Just to first of all, to sort of put context in it, as I said, once Danny Boy was over that night, and the arrangements made for the handing over the dead and the transfer of the prisoners down south was organised. Actually, my main concern that night was that the insurgents, who were still very much out and about, would hit that isolated post of Simic House in Alamara, I've already spoken about, and Camp Condor, if not indeed come directly for our own main base. Now, the main base was easily defendable. The others were far less so. And to get to them, we didn't know what was in the way. And so we spent the night planning a company squadron plus clearance of Route 6. And in our thoughts are in place mines, further defensive positions, etc. Because right then, our main supply route, as far as we were concerned, we were cut off. It was effectively out of bounds, and we didn't know what was happening on that road. So, and there was continuing fighting over the next few days, etc., etc. So, whatever else was on our minds immediately afterwards, it was certainly not what was to come out. But I think there were two initial references to it. Firstly, there was a video released on, it's 20 years ago, very nascent social media, as it were, which showed the arrival of the dead into the hospital. I said they'd been collected by the medics from our medical staff, from our camp. And it showed a number of individuals on that video shouting very loudly that the bodies had been maltreated or showed some form of torture. Now, my initial thought on that was twofold. Firstly, they would say that, wouldn't they? And by that, I mean it suited the political agenda at the time. And dare I say, and I think one has to be very, very aware of that, that is exactly what the Saddam Hussein's team would have done to these people. They would have brutalized them as prisoners, and they possibly would have brutalized them even as the dead. So to an extent, yes, I understand why they say that. And the second thing is that I don't think people understand, and I hope they never really do, the effect that modern weaponry has on the human body. It's not like the movies. There's not a small hole with a little blood. A small arms round, a rifle round, as it were, is designed to dump 14 kilojoules of energy into the body. It's a very technical term. But what that does is it causes cavitation through the shockwave of it entering the body to shake up the internal organs. Then if it hits something solid like a bone, it tumbles on its journey through the body, obviously having effects on the internalities there, before leaving probably with a larger exit wound than an entry wound. And that's just a simple single rifle bullet. And as I said, warriors and tanks had fired at Danny Boy. So battlefield wounds can be shocking. And I wonder whether I imagine that the individuals in the video, having seen these, given their previous experience as a society in the way that authorities acted, and the heightened feelings at the time, that there was an element of, I understand why they're saying it, and thought little more of it. But the second indication I had was from a UK journalist. I think it's from the Sunday Times, but I don't know. I can't remember. Now, he was with us to do a wider piece, and he mentioned the allegations. But again, I explained to him the political atmosphere and the effects of weapons and thought no more about it. But equally balanced against this, far more, were my contacts in the local society, politicians, police, military, and informally just tribal leaders. And they sort of weren't convinced at all. They knew of it, but they laughed it off, but they dismissed it. They very much saw it as typical for Majar al Kabir, and including the police chief, as I say, whose hometown was Majar al Kabir. And he personally knew a number of those who were making allegations and said, yeah, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? But most interestingly, much later in the tour, actually, and they were the only two times the allegations came up in the tour, I met actually with the Imam of Majar al Kabir, and I mentioned the allegations to him. And he just smiled and shook his head and said, yeah, he didn't believe them, which I thought was pretty ironic, as he was probably the man who wound
Stirred it
up
all
the
up
ambush
in
in
the
the first
day.
place. Yeah. But, he just sort of smiled and said, nothing to them. And interestingly then, that was it. And we returned, we came back from the tour, we did an Armstrong move to Germany, and it was actually a number of years passed, before those two little mentions is dismissed by society, Iraqis, locals, and even the Imam. But years later, they raised their head again.
So, when it did arise, the Al-Sweady inquiry accused troops of unlawful killings and mistreatment, but ultimately cleared your soldiers. So what was it like to go through years of scrutiny and legal process?
Irritating.
That's a very downplayed adjective there, I think, Matt.
But I think I just got the British Award for understatement. It was irritating. Look, we actually went through two judicial experiences, if I can put it that way. First in 2009, and again I come back, this is 5 years after the event. 5 years after the event. We went to the Old Bailey to a judicial review, as it's called, where we found ourselves literally in the dock, like you see on TV, being questioned by a barrister in front of three very senior judges with long wigs and red robes. It was the full 9 yards of courtroom drama.
Was that just yourself and the ops officer, or was that everybody that was involved on the day?
No, that was everyone involved on the day. It was everyone involved in the prisoner handling. It was that REMI staff sergeant. And we started to go through this process, and it ran for 4 months. But after 4 months, the judges questioned the Ministry of Defence's competence in presenting evidence, and the Secretary of State for Defence then had to concede that there were failures on behalf of the Ministry of Defence, such that it would prevent the court from making a satisfactory ruling. And so at that point, the Defence Secretary had to sort of eat his own smoke or whatever, and he had to announce that there would be a public inquiry into the allegations. So we went back to square one and started the whole thing again. So this was a little bit like, doing that, the famous run, seeing the truck, actually getting on the truck and then being got off the truck and told you've got to go back round to the circuit again. But so we thought, okay, fine, we'll go to the Old Bailey, we'll clear it, and actually it didn't work. And so the public inquiry, Al-Sweady, was formed in November 2009, and it published its report in November 2014, 5 years and £25 million later, and a decade after the events of that May afternoon I've just described. It heard oral evidence, that's in attendance by person, from 282 of us, and it read the witness statements of another 328 witnesses. Now, I just want to quote, perhaps at length, if I may, from the final report, and then we can come back to it. But let me just quote this. Quote, and this is from the chair. In my view, it is worth emphasising once more that the events with which this inquiry was concerned commenced with a deadly, planned and coordinated armed ambush of British troops on Route 6 on the 14th of May 2004. That ambush was carried out by a large number of heavily armed Iraqi insurgents who were bent on inflicting as much death, injury and damage upon British forces as they could. Although my terms of reference do not permit me to investigate or comment upon the conduct of the British soldiers during the resulting battle, it does seem to me that the evidence clearly showed that the British soldiers responded to this deadly ambush with exemplary courage, resolution and professionalism. I was impressed by the way in which the military witnesses approached the giving of their evidence to this inquiry. Some of them evidently found the process, including the need to recall the events, very difficult and distressing. I have also come to the firm conclusion that the approach of the detainees and that of a number of other Iraqi witnesses to the giving of their evidence was both unprincipled in the extreme and wholly without regard for the truth. Such was the extent to which some of these witnesses told deliberate and calculated lies to this inquiry. I have come to the firm conclusion that the allegations made against the British military, including, without exception, all the most serious allegations, were wholly and entirely without merit or justification. Very many of those baseless allegations were the product of deliberate and calculated lies on the part of those who made them and who then gave evidence to this inquiry to support and perpetuate them." Unquote. So 10 years, about 30 million quid, to be told what we knew the morning after, both the British forces and the local Iraqis. So as I say, irritating. But I think beyond that, when we were going through this, that the BBC produced a very, very one-sided panorama programme, which cited the allegations, which turned out to be baseless allegations, the product of deliberate and calculated lies, but not much more. And you won't be surprised perhaps to know they didn't produce one following the inquiry's outcome and conclusions I've just read. But here's the thing, the punchline to all of this, which nobody could have anticipated, was that it largely need not have taken place. Because it transpired in 2007, that is 2 years before the 10-year legal process started. The solicitors acting on behalf of the Iraqis had in their possession, from the office of Muqtada al-Sadr in Majar al Kabir, a document that stated the names and the other details of the 9 detainees and named them as platoons of the Mahdi Army. It's basically a Mahdi Army all back. Now, the significance of this, as I understand it, was twofold. Firstly, the Iraqis had given evidence that those involved firing at us in the actions around Danny Boy were complete civilians. I remember one claimed that he was a young man out buying honey for a sick mother, and the other was in the field studying, and they're absolutely two serious alibis, as it were. Despite them, of course, being found with, as I've said, AKs, RPGs, and ammo wearing chest webbing, and as you've just heard from the chair, it was a deliberate ambush. But secondly, what this meant, the main individual solicitor involved was charged with defrauding legal aid, and he was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment for 3 counts of fraud. I just want to quote from his finding very briefly. This is about this individual. The defendant defrauded a statutory legal body for his own selfish motives. As a result of the deliberate failure to disclose his serious breaches of the rules governing legal aid and his professional code of conduct, Shiner was able to retain his highly lucrative legal aid contract and obtain taxpayer-funded legal aid payments, unquote. Now, those legal aid payments were in millions of pounds. And so, after all that, the dog who'd actually come after us was himself found guilty of charges, sentenced to prison, struck off, bankrupted, and his company dissolved. So, yeah, we won on the battlefield that afternoon. We won in the court, and we went on to get a bonus win in the legal system. But, yeah, quite irritating in all aspects to have 10 years of one's life impacted by all that.
What happened with your regiment at Danny Boy? I don't know if it was just after it, just before it, but you had the Daily Mirror and Piers Morgan publishing false photographs accusing British soldiers of prisoner handling issues as well.
Yeah, that was beforehand, but we were in Iraq at the time. And that had 2 consequences, I think, those false photographs, one of which was it just poured fire onto fights that we were already having, as I've described. And secondly, I think it just put it in the mind of locals and others that, yes, this could possibly might be true. Although, of course, they were, as you say, untrue photographs. So, it was that's what happened to us afterwards over the next 10 years.
Do you feel the British government and military leadership did enough to support Union men during and after the inquiry?
Okay, let me just tell you this. Throughout the entire decade-long legal process, I, nor any of my soldiers, received a single email or letter or anything from the army. Not one. Not before, not during, or not after.
That's actually quite sure. I'm not trying to stir it here. It's a podcast, but that is shocking to me.
And that is a fact. That is a complete fact. Now, I think when you contrast it, and you would have been, in your roles, and many who are listening will recognise the pattern where one soldiers might perhaps be drunk disorderly in a local pub, unknown for the British military, and appear in front of the magistrates. And as a young officer, you put your best, regal Her Majesty's or His Majesty's suit on. You go down and plead the case for that young soldier, and perhaps to the point where NATO will fail were he not to be, merely fined, not sentenced to custodial thing. But you look after your troops, right or wrong, you have that pastoral care. That's day one, week one, Sandhurst. That's not about covering up. That's not about them not taking punishment, but it's about looking after your people. So we went through that, and we did not have a single email, letter, or anything from that. Now, to be honest with you, I'm not sure this makes it even better or worse, but I actually don't think it's a conspiracy. I just think it was utter ignorant negligence, because what happened was we first heard out of, I think everyone else first heard about this, was we got this letter from an organisation called the Treasury Solicitors. Now, that was a government organisation I had never heard of before. And bear in mind, I worked in Whitehall for 4 years in the Ministry of Defence, but I'm sure the soldiers hadn't. But these are actually the government solicitors, and they act on all legal matters for the government. Now, in fairness to them, I personally thought they were very, very good. They were very sympathetic. They were very empathetic. They were very understanding. But they weren't our family. They weren't the army. Our family didn't contact us. But I think that the MOD, who were kind of in the dock, as it were, and they got it wrong, they said, right, well, we've done our role. We've handed it over to the Treasury Solicitors. And I don't know whether Headquarters Army thought, oh, well, it's an ongoing process. It went on for a long time. No one really paid attention. And I just think it just fell through the cracks. I genuinely, people might be shouting, at their headphones now that I'm naive, but equally, I've did 27 years in the army, and I think it's always cock up over conspiracy. And as I say, I think it was ignorant negligence rather than anything else. But no, the fact is, we didn't hear anything from the army through our.
I do find that genuinely shocking. And when we were talking on the last podcast, I found it quite bizarre when you were reiterating the point that you had each contact had to be accounted for, if you like, and the RMP would, at the start, come and speak to soldiers. But if you remember Northern Ireland, we had the system called the flying lawyer, which was designed to help soldiers who'd been in a contact. Now, I'm not directly comparing Northern Ireland with the absolute chaos and intensity of Iraq, but to your knowledge, was there anything like that set up out there at the time to try and give soldiers a bit of protection at the time on the ground?
No, not that I know of, no. And I went to Northern Ireland sort of 4 or 5 times, including as the adjutant, twice, in fact, as an adjutant. And there wasn't that flying lawyer support at all. No, not
what, Northern Ireland?
No, in Iraq.
Sorry, yeah. I was going to say, because we were told.
Yeah, no, I mean, no. Sorry, as an adjutant in Northern Ireland, my point was an adjutant in Northern Ireland. I was fully aware of it, as we all were briefed about it. But no, in Iraq, if it existed, I never heard of it.
So, next question then. What lessons do you think the British Army and the nation, because we are servants of the nation, what lessons should be taken away from the experience of the battle and the inquiry?
Well, let's start with the battle, because, that's the area you and I probably are more comfortable in than courtrooms. But I think the battle itself probably didn't show any new lessons tactically per se, but what it did do is absolutely reinforce some old ones. Firstly, close quarter combat is brutal, is vicious, it's frightening. And the outcome rests on the training, the professionalism, the determination, and the sheer bloody courage of those taking part. What I described there was two NCOs conducting a Brecon X-range pairs fire manoeuvre up a trench system, and doing it well, but doing it for real. But they are professional infantry senior NCOs, or NCOs, one comes on major, one junior NCO. But yeah, that will win. So yeah, train hard, be professional, and that'll kick in. I think the inquiry is more complex, and I think my answer probably is going to come as a surprise to a lot of people, given all the we went through and the duplicity of the solicitors involved. But although, look, the allegations were found out, as I've just quoted, quote, beyond all doubt, wholly without foundation and entirely the product of deliberate lies, reckless speculation, and ingrained hostility, the allegations were serious. The allegations were that British soldiers of the British Army had taken individuals prisoner, tortured them horrendously, and then murdered them in cold blood. So they are incredibly serious allegations. So if they've been proven to be true, this would have been the worst actions by the British Army for, well, forever, frankly. It would have been British Army's My Lai, and worse than the Bloody Sunday allegations in some ways. And look, soldiers cannot be above the law. The UK and the British Army could not, on hearing those allegations, have said, yeah, well, and not do anything about it. And I would also say, if you open the aperture of the lens in a way and think of the grand strategic on a wider canvas, the army in everywhere I've been, Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, we've tended to go into a foreign land under the very wide strapline, as it were, that we, the United Kingdom, represent democracy, the rule of law, transparency, freedom from corruption, etc. And our army will set an example by all that they do so that you can see, the local indigenous people, what good looks like. Not in a patronizing way, but because you have been in many of those countries under an oppressive regime for generations, and we will show you the model of good. Now, you cannot do that and then just not respond to any serious allegations in a serious way, as were made against us. And I think, with respect, that some people and perhaps some elements of the veterans community forget that bigger picture. We are subject to the rule of law. We go into foreign countries and we say that we will show you a better way. If they make a serious allegation, you can't just go, yeah, but something had to be done. So I personally, my soldiers, as I say, went through a 10-year legal process from gripping the rail in the Old Bailey, appearing in our public inquiry, subject to media scrutiny and being crawled all over, and all for lies, and of course lies by the UK legal agents. But, and this is the but, the principle remains, as I say, we are not above the law, and part of that is being investigated, being questioned, and putting yourself out there for judgment. And let me say there's another perspective on this on the personal level. Let's just say those serious allegations hadn't been investigated at all, never followed up. I and my soldiers would always have hanging over us, whispered about. You turn up on a course, your name appears on a promotion list. You go on something, with other military people. And then would really people say, oh, yeah, put one PWRR, you heard what they did. have that hanging over us rather than, after 600 witness statements, all the investigation, all the clinical forensic investigations over those 10 years. Again, I'm going to quote this. The British soldiers responded to this deadly ambush with exemplary courage, resolution, and professionalism. I have come to the firm conclusion that the allegations made against the British military, including without exception all the most serious allegations, were wholly and entirely without merit or justification. Unquote. I'll take that. For all the pain in getting there, I'll take that.
I'm rereading Slim's book, Defeat into Victory, at the minute.
Right.
And in it, he wrote a line saying that without discipline, an army's just a mob. And I think that's another thread that went through your battalion, that discipline to keep themselves in check. And I remember when I was in Northern Ireland in '89 and two of the lads from our troop were killed in an IED, the battery sergeant major made it entirely clear what would happen if any of us stepped over the line. The full wrath of him and the army would come down upon us. Now, I'm not saying that without that talk, something would have happened, but that guy made it clear. And soldiers are only human. The other thing is, when you're talking about what happened at Danny Boy, you've described what those soldiers went through, fighting a determined enemy in depth, what they saw in the aftermath of the battle, how they took prisoners. That discipline and regimental ethos is also running through everything you've described. Do you think that's a fair point?
Yeah, I do. I absolutely think that's fair. And I go back to the point. If we'd have been, let's just say, not swept under the carpet or given the most cursory examination and written off, as it were, the allegations off the, about the murder, mutilation, torture piece, then I think you start to end up on a slightly slippery slope. And I think perhaps one saw this with the American forces in Vietnam in certain areas, not all of them and not everywhere, and not all the time. And I want to be very clear about that. But standards started to slip. The way that the soldiers were conducting themselves in the field towards the civilian population, dare I say, it might start with a slap and then, and you move on, or stealing a bit here and there and you move on. But very, very quickly, it will degenerate into something more serious. The old cliche is true. The standards you set are the ones you walk past. And if you don't set these standards, and at the almost tactical level, as you've just described, right the way up to the grand strategic, this is what us and our nation and our army as instruments of that nation stand for, then you are in a very difficult and dark place, I think. So as I say, I think many people listening to this might say, oh goodness, you must be really, really angry. And of course I am. I'm irritated about it. But at the end of the day, the result that came out of it, by so clearing our names, cleared our names forever in the most unequivocal way. And yeah, okay, I can now live the rest of my life. I can look back on my professional military career, as can every single one of those individuals involved. And as was said, with exemplary courage, resolution, and professionalism. I'll take that. I'll take that for a bit of irritation.
No, I totally agree. And I think it's interesting you use My Lai in Vietnam as one of your examples when it can go really badly wrong. And I also think My Lai is an interesting discussion about leadership, ethics, morals, physical and moral courage, because when Callie's company went in that day and started massacring that village, it was partially stopped by the helicopter pilot flying above who saw what was going on. I forget his name now. It was really annoying.
Yeah.
But
I know what you mean.
He landed and said to his gunner, cover me. And if these guys start, as in Callie's soldiers, open up on them. And he stepped up to that platoon and said, you've got to stop what you're doing. And I just think, again, these things that can happen and get out of control very, very quickly. One man can stop it or one man can keep it going.
And the other two things about My Lie, I don't know whether you saw there was a recent relatively PBS series on Vietnam, which I just found eye-opening in that My Lie was very well known about through the chain of command. It was covered up. And when the president found out that My Lie had been exposed, and they've got very good this series because they've got the public records. His initial reaction about My Lie was, "Who leaked it?"
Not what they did.
Which I just found was stunning.
Yeah.
And then the second thing was they interviewed a soldier on this series who, once that company had moved off out the area, the next rotation were patrolling through that series of villages, including My Lai, and it was very, very hostile. And this young 19-year-old at the time could not work it out because they'd never been told what happened. And so they were getting into nasty, nasty, nasty actions, which were absolutely out of character for the rest of the area. Why? Because no one had told them what had happened. So there were more soldiers getting killed because it had been covered up. And this is why these things need to be investigated correctly and exposed and transparent about them. Which, as I say, many of your listeners may be thinking this is a very odd or in some way counter-narrative reaction, but there's another side to thinking about this.
Yeah, and ultimately you've got the other extreme where the Canadian Airborne Regiment was found guilty of torturing prisoners in, I think it was Somalia. And the Canadian government, to their credit, acted incredibly swiftly, just disbanded the unit, got rid of the whole unit.
Indeed. Yeah, a whole lot gone.
There's two very extremes there of how to handle a situation in some respects.
Yeah, there is. Yeah, there are there are differences in that, aren't there? I mean, they are different ends of the spectrum entirely. But I think it's up to the nations to decide how they wish to deal with this. And obviously, the US, right the way up to the president, covered up My Lie, and the Canadians, right the way from the get-go, cut the whole thing out. Others can judge, whether there might have been a better and more measured response. And I think perhaps the Al Sweady inquiry, however uncomfortable it is, however costly it is, however long it is, however irritating it is, it gets you there in the end, as it were. And I go back to the fact that bear in mind what the allegations were. They had to be properly investigated. They weren't an investigation into an ND. These were serious, serious allegations of prisoners being tortured and then murdered cold-bloodedly at the hands of British soldiers. They were serious allegations.
And Danny Boy then has become synonymous with both a fierce engagement and controversy, as we've already described. But how did the battle affect the morale and identity of one PWR going forward?
Two sides to this. I think for one PWRR as an organisation, the Battle of Danny Boy became part of the narrative of our time on TELIC 4, and it built on that picture. Because, as I say, it was a large multi-sided contact, and it was one heck of a fight. We've fought others before, and we're going to do so again. But this was different in terms of scale and all the things I've gone into. But I think actually the major and the most long-lasting effect of the battle goes back to that decision to remove the dead. As the inquiry report acknowledged, as the brigade commander acknowledged, that's caused a great deal of trauma among those required to do so. And certainly recollecting that to the inquiries exacerbated that trauma. I think that and the nature of the close quarter fighting, I think probably out of everything on the tour, caused the most post-tour concerns over well-being.
And is that still an ongoing legacy? Obviously, just generally asking. So, the measures you just talked about that had to be enacted on the battle space that day, I take it they're still affecting people involved to this day.
I think some of them are. Yeah, I think some of them are. I think, again, Stuart Tito, I mean, the practicalities of moving those dead, as I say, the effects of weaponry on bodies, which I've already touched upon. And then there was a reality of those bodies had to be literally piled into warriors, into which then the soldiers had to be transported back in at the same time. And that whole experience, that traumatized, understandably, a lot of the young lads.
Yeah, I understand. So, moving on to sort of another slightly different subject, but it is related to what we've been talking about. What are your thoughts on the repealing of the Northern Ireland Legacy Act?
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, I'm not hugely au fait with all the details and the ins and outs of that. Sometimes I think as a retired officer, you're no longer on the team, so you're no longer on the team, as it were. It's already talking about what you did, but what other people had to face. But I think if I can just give an insight into these, into having something inquired into years after it's happened, and a specific lesson I identified that I had through going through what we did. And it's about witness evidence, and it's about documentary evidence. Forget a military context. In general, if 3 people, for example, witness events, you will have 3 different witness statements. Yeah, the car that was involved was black. No, it wasn't. It was dark blue. No, it wasn't. It was green. The individual was wearing a red top, an orange top, grey top, whatever. And that will be immediately after the event. Immediately after the event. And then that recall gets even more extenuated over time. It gets poorer over time. And it also gets warped over time. So individuals, if they then discuss that event, particularly with other witnesses, or they read about the event later on, they do accrue a common view. And they shift their view towards almost a squad average. And that is absolute. You ask any criminal barrister, you ask any police officer, that is a subject of numerous PhDs, numerous social studies experts. They are facts. And it impacted in our inquiry in a way, because I was surprised to read some of the statements that were written down on our long journey through the courts, where individuals absolutely 100% with full honesty believed the details they were giving were true. But they just couldn't be right, because time, place, space, whatever. They thought they were true, but they weren't. And actually the inquiry were very, very understanding of this and very accepting of it. And I go back to that quote from the chair of the inquiry, quote, "I was impressed by the way in which the military witnesses approached the giving their evidence this inquiry." But I can assure you there were anomalies, and they're recognised by the inquiry, and great parts that equally just couldn't be recollected after 10 years. I mean, I was, as I say, put in a witness stand twice, and I was asked questions, and almost not in a hostile way, because there were gaps. And I said, look, as I've just described that night, 100 things to think about, the next day, we're all a bit sleep deprived, etc. I said, I just can't remember. It's a reasonable question to ask, what did I think of this? But I just can't remember. So, and then documentation. You will know, because the Royal Regiment, has loads of fantastic communicators communicating data, writing it in those old, signals logs. Yeah. I literally don't know where they went 10 years later. Nor does anyone. People look, but they couldn't find them. So documentation gets genuinely lost. Stuff goes adrift. And so the carrying out any investigation over a time after the events have happened, personal recollection, documentation, it is going to lead to unreliability. Now, just the old thing, justice denied is justice delayed is justice denied. But also, in a way, justice delayed is going to get justice very hard to be met over 20, 30 years. Now, some nations, not in the UK, but in America, for example, they have this statute of limitations on answering some crimes, not all of them by any means, but some of them. Part of that actually is because this is recognized. This is academically, scientifically recognized that beyond a certain period of time for certain lower level crimes, that the evidence will not be true. It just won't be true. It will be corrupted in some way. With the best will in the world, with people trying to be the most honest they can be, it won't be there. So all I would say is that if you're doing investigations, and as I say, ours started 5 years after the event and concluded 10 years after the event. My personal opinion is that's pretty much the limit you can take people to, 5 years as a start point. Beyond this, it gets really, really murky.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Ultimately I agree with what you said earlier on, that British soldiers are not above the law. Otherwise, we're a mob. And you can't have that. Yeah. But equally, what you said there about the time limitations. And of course, we do have some documentation, whereas PWRR and others don't have any documentation at all for historical inquiries. So it's, but anyway,
Whoops.
It'll be interesting to see where that one goes. Matt, thank you for coming on again. I really, really enjoyed that. Well, probably enjoy is the wrong word, but very, 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 very illuminating to what your soldiers went through, and not just during the contacts of the Battle of Danny Boy, but also in the years that followed. We did Desert Island Dits the other week there, but so we're not going to have a full Desert Island Dits. But are you reading anything of interest at the minute?
I'm actually reading a book on Dunkirk by I've forgotten it. It's just behind me. Which is fascinating for the utter resilience of the British soldier. But at times it is heartrending where these excellent county regiments, regular soldiers who've served through the 1930s, they know what they're about. And it's almost, how it ends, as it were, but they are fighting tooth and nail, under-equipped, under-resourced, against the odds. And it is both heartening at the tactical level, but unbelievably depressing. And I think I said on my last chat with you, bear in mind, you go out the door to war with what you've got on your body or your shelves at the time. And this is just another reminder that if you get that wrong, you are going to get rolled up and really good people are going to die. So, yeah, that's a cheery ending, isn't it? But no, sorry about that. Well, that's a buzzkill. Well, but no, that's what I'm reading at the moment.
I was Battery Sergeant Major of K Battery, and the Royal Artillery, its colours are its guns, its battle honours are normally given as part of the battery title. And I was BSM of K Battery, whose battery honour title was Hondigam. And that was 27th of May 1940, retreat from Dunkirk. They basically were told, hold your ground. And they set the guns up in the outskirts of a village. They were manhandling the guns through the streets, taking the Germans on over open sights.
Yep.
And you read the battery war diary, guys got MCs, BC got a DSO, all this sort of stuff. Lots of guys killed, lots of guys wounded, lots of guys taken prisoner. And we got a battle honour for that. But I then went into the battery history room, and they had the war diary from the German Panzer Regiment. And I was thinking, this is going to be interesting. Fully with the Battle of Hondigam. It was basically at 15 hours, we came across a determined band of British soldiers who held us up for 8 hours before we rolled through the village. I paraphrased, but that was it.
Yeah.
And you're just thinking, it's interesting to read it from the other side. That's not taking away what those soldiers did, because the battery sends, they'll get very, very close ties with the village of Hondigam to this day. And we send people there every year, and we do a battlefield tour, and we go around the old gun positions, and we see what those guys achieved. And there's soldiers from the battery buried in a local cemetery. They put on a barbecue. We have a game of football with them. And there's even a street named after them, the battery. But it's interesting to see that for us, it was a major engagement and part of our battery history. But for the Germans, it was just another British unit that they rolled over.
But you know what? Is it ultimately, for those guys and for others, is the point that the grand strategic, win or lose, or is it? Did those guys wake up that morning thinking that we would be talking about them? What is it now? 60, 80 years on.
Probably like most soldiers, they fought for the guy left and right of them.
And they fought for the guy left and right. They did the absolute bloody best. And I think how one honours them is by conversations like this. Strange enough, they say that you die twice. Once when you die, and the second time when no one remembers you. And the fact that we are sitting here talking about those guys and remembering those guys, and they've got a battery named after them, means that they will be forever remembered.
And when you, from my perspective, you as a battery sergeant major of that unit, that's your legacy you've got to uphold.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And that is the thing. That is the standard. There you go.
Yeah. That's it for another episode. Thanks to our guest for coming on, and to you, the podcast listener, for your continued support and suggestions. Please keep them coming, and our email and social media links are at the bottom of the show notes. You can find us on all the usual suspects, including Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And if you download us from iTunes and like the podcast, it'd be great if you could leave us a review there or anywhere you get your podcasts from. Finally, thanks again to Nick Beale for his continuing help and offering technical support for his company ISAR, and we'll see you next time on The Unconventional Soldier.